racing drivers had been competing under fake names since the dawn of the automobile. Some of racing's original rich aristocrats wanted to protect their identity from a disapproving family who might yoink their inheritance at a moment's notice. Some other drivers just didn't want to hurt mom's feelings, especially if they had a sibling who'd already gotten hurt behind the wheel. Some were women trying to get away with racing under an ambiguous name, and still others opted to race under a name that was kind of reminiscent of their own, but with a few little changes to keep some distance. But there was at least one driver competing under a kind of sort of fake name in the NASCAR world, and that was L.W. Wright. See, L.W. Wright turned up out of nowhere to compete in exactly one race, the 1982 Winston 500. He did so with a whole lot of confidence, a whole lot of lies, and a competition license that NASCAR was legally required to issue him. After just 13 laps, he pulled into the pits at Talladega Superspeedway, and he disappeared for decades, leaving a whole lot of bounce checks and unanswered questions in his wake. But who was L.W. Wright, the man who became known as the D.B. Cooper of auto racing? What became of him? In today's episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to find out. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'd like to invite you to join me in a little bit of a flashback before we get started. I want us both to imagine what NASCAR was like in the 1980s. Now, I have no doubt that some of you listening to this episode actually lived that experience, but I personally was born a little too late to experience the sport in its heyday, and I think it certainly helps to understand the era to really understand the L.W. Wright fiasco. For NASCAR, the 1980s was a boom period, unlike nothing the sport had seen before. That happened for a lot of reasons, but the big one was broadcasting. For the 1979 Daytona 500, NASCAR managed to negotiate flag-to-flag coverage of the entire race for the first time. That would have been an accomplishment in and of itself, but viewership numbers for that race were way better than expected thanks to Mother Nature. See, a huge storm had blown in on the East Coast during the Daytona 500 weekend that year. Tens of thousands of people were trapped in their homes after being snowed in, while plenty of others simply decided that they had no interest in leaving the house on that cold Sunday afternoon. So they flipped on the television, scrolled through the handful of channels available at the time, and settled down to watch NASCAR. The race ended in chaos, with the leaders wiping each other out and then engaging in a fist fight on the side of the track after the checkered flag waved. When folks headed back to work after the snow melted, that fight was the only thing they wanted to talk about. It was one of the first water cooler moments where office workers all gathered around the water cooler to talk about that wild thing they saw on TV the night before. Even though the fist fight did cement a lot of beliefs that NASCAR was a roughneck sport, the 1979 Daytona broadcast did also launch the sport onto the national radar. Major newspapers were talking about it, and folks who might have had no prior interest in racing had actually watched an event, and they loved it too. As the 80s progressed, the number of televised races grew, which brought in wider audiences. The folks who fell in love with NASCAR on TV started to buy tickets to races, and the series signed big-name sponsors and built more grandstands to house fans at the track. Prize purses increased to the point where it wasn't too shocking to see drivers clearing $1 million at the end of the year. The cars themselves changed, the competition grew, and stars like Dale Earnhardt, Terry Labonte, and more emerged from the woodwork. Raise the stakes and the prize purses, and you're naturally going to increase the desire to win at all costs, even illegally. There were plenty of huge cheats, like boring out the engines or increasing the size of the fuel tank, but there was also plenty of other commonplace under-the-table rule bending that took place at the track. After all, it was pretty easy to slip a tech inspector a few extra bucks to look the other way when he was supposed to be scouring your vehicle for faults, or to interfere with a timing sensor by pointing a laser at it. If you weren't cheating, you weren't racing. I think that's a really critical thing to consider during this episode on L.W. Wright. I guarantee that there are going to be multiple times during the course of this story where you wonder why nobody questioned this man. why no one was suspicious, why no one did their digging. Just keep reminding yourself that this was an era where fudging the rules was basically a national pastime. As long as your checks cleared, no one had any issues. It should come as no surprise then that fraudulent checks play a huge role in our story today. The first time anyone ever heard of L.W. Wright, it was April in 1982. A man who called himself William Dunaway from Hendersonville, Tennessee, reached out to a newspaper in Nashville with some big news. He was representing a driver named L.W. Wright in the upcoming Winston 500 at Talladega Speedway, and he wanted to promote said driver. The announcement read as such: Nashville driver L.W. Wright yesterday announced he will be attempting to qualify for next week's Winston 500 Grand National Race at Talladega, Alabama. The 33-year-old Wright, a veteran of 43 Grand National races, will drive a 1981 Monte Carlo. The name of Wright's team is Music City Racing, and among his sponsors are country music stars Merle Haggard and T.G. Shepherd. Haggard is scheduled to appear at Talladega with his driver. Now, that was some interesting news. We have a relative newbie coming into the sport with some impressive backing from big-name country stars and a whole lot of gumption. That's just the kind of thing that NASCAR thrived on. And here begins our con. Today, it would have been easy to figure out Wright's game. We could run a quick search on Racing Reference to find out that old Wright didn't actually have any of the credentials he claimed he did. We'd learned that he hadn't entered a single NASCAR race, let alone 43. And just like that, the jig would be up. But in 1982, no one really had any idea. To preserve this mystery, I really want to tell the story from NASCAR's point of view first, and then we'll circle back around to unveil the true nature of the scam in time. As race day approached for the Winston 500, more questions began to pop up. Somehow, Wright had acquired enough money to compete in the race and had a semi-trailer to carry his race car. He found a black and gold Chevrolet Monte Carlo on offer from driver Sterling Marlin and purchased it for $20,700, with a $17,000 cash payment made on the spot and a check written for the rest. See, Marlin was intrigued. Despite the fact that he was a regular in the NASCAR world, he had no idea who this Wright character was. But if he was going to be a big spender, well, it wouldn't hurt to hop on the bandwagon. He even offered to serve as Wright's crew chief. He even said he'd cobbled together a crew of mechanics for the weekend. But seeds of doubt started to spring up. T.G. Shepherd had read the news story that claimed he was sponsoring some guy by the name of L.W. Wright, and he went on to deny that he had any connection to that man, that he'd never offered anyone a sponsorship. Shepherd's tax attorney spoke to the Tennessean to add, in fact, T.G. said he had never heard of the guy. Something mighty fishy's going on somewhere. In his own defense, Wright simply said the announcement of the sponsorship was premature. Something fishy indeed. By that point, Wright was already at the track, where word spread quickly about this mysterious driver who had allegedly raced against plenty of these drivers in 43 Grand National events. The only problem was that no one had any idea who he was. Even if he'd been a pretty nondescript driver, well, you could probably safely assume that someone would have gotten to know him. But Wright had an answer for that too. See, the media announcement had gotten it all wrong. He'd never raced in any Grand National events. Of course not. He'd only participated in the sportsman class, but on tracks that also hosted Grand National events. The publisher just got confused. It was an easy enough answer, but Sterling Marlin was growing more suspicious by the second. In a 2019 interview with ESPN, Marlin claimed that Wright was saying he had a great history in racing up at short tracks in Virginia, but also couldn't name any of the popular drivers at the time. Marlin said, "I decided I'd go down there with him, be his crew chief, just to keep an eye on him, you know. As soon as we got there, it all got even fishier." See, Wright started asking questions. Questions that Marlin said, quote, any real racer would have already known the answer to. They were the kind of questions someone would start asking the first time they laid eyes on a 2.6-mile oval track. The kind of questions you'd start to ask if you'd never actually sat in the cockpit of a race car. NASCAR itself even wondered what the hell this guy was doing, but, well, he'd paid for his racing license, and he had a car, so he had to qualify, right? In qualifying, Benny Parsons took pole position with a speed of 200.176 miles per hour, the first time anyone had cracked the 200 mile per hour marker in a stock car at that circuit. 29 of the 40 qualifiers were in the 190 mile per hour range or above. L.W. Wright was not one of them. Wright went out and set 2 flying laps, good enough for a speed of 187.376 miles per hour and a 36th place starting slot with his name on it. Then he crashed the car. Somehow Marlin and his hodgepodge crew were able to make the necessary repairs, so the Monte Carlo was ready to race on Sunday, and Wright joined the starting grid on May 2nd, 1982, ahead of 4 other drivers: Slick Johnson, J.D. McDuffie, Bill Scott, and Pharrell Harris. 4 laps into the race, the 29th place starter David Simcoe crashed. After 6 more laps under yellow, the race went green, and 3 laps after that, Wright was lapped for the first time. On lap 13, he pulled off the track. There are differing reports here, either that he blew his engine or that NASCAR showed him the black flag for being too slow. The latter seems a little bit more plausible since the ESPN commentator Larry Nuber reported, quote, "The black flag is coming out for one of the back markers, perhaps a little bit of an experience showing for the young driver." L.W. Wright was classified in 39th place at the 1982 Winston 500. Wright pulled into the pit lane and climbed out of his car, then headed directly to collect the $1,545 check that he earned for starting the race. Today, that'd be worth right around $5,000. By the time the checkered flag flew, Wright was gone. His car, his Music City Racing pit crew, and all of the equipment he borrowed remained at Talladega. And then, days later, his checks started to bounce. "Don't ask me if I was surprised," Marlin said in 2019, "because I was not." But how much money did Wright owe? And to whom did he owe it? Who the hell was accepting huge checks from a total stranger anyway? Let's wind the clock back and start digging in this mystery, starting with one man named B.W. Bernie Terrell. Somehow, someway, this mysterious L.W. Wright and his Music City Racing team had nabbed a meeting with Terrell, who was then in charge of a company called Space Age Marketing. We don't know a ton about Space Age's actual remit, but being a Nashville company, it seemed like they had something to do with the music industry. When Terrell sat down with a big-talking race car driver who claimed to already have support from Merle Haggard and T.G. Shepard, all he saw were dollar signs. "I didn't know anything about racing," Terrell told UPI in June of 1982. "He really got me good, but I've hired a private detective to track him down, and we'll get him sooner or later. He'll end up in jail before we're through." Terrell was, as far as we know, the first person from whom L.W. Wright swindled some money. The marketing head told UPI that he gave Wright a whopping $30,000 in cash to buy a car, plus another $7,500 in expenses to take care of things like travel, food, and more. If we adjust that for inflation, we're talking over $120,000. In a different story, a few days later, Terrell claimed that his private detective had already tracked down a number of things about Wright. He was a smooth talker and just as nice and sincere as could be, Terrell said, before reviewing the expenses. He added that he paid Sterling Marlin back for the $3,700 check that bounced, and that Wright took a tractor-trailer with him that no one was quite sure he owned. If you're wondering how Wright even managed to secure a competition license, well, that was easy. See, NASCAR was bound by right to work laws. Those laws basically state that employees can choose whether or not they join a union in a workplace, but when it came to a sport like NASCAR, the interpretation of the law meant that as long as someone could pay for a competition license, an entry fee, and turn up with a capable car, they had to be allowed to race. Wright had all of those things. He submitted a check for $115 to NASCAR for the competition license and an additional $100 to enter the race. He had his Monte Carlo, so NASCAR had to give him a shot. The expenses kept mounting, and Wright kept writing checks. He spent $1,500 to get pit passes for his crew, who also applied for either driver's or mechanics licenses. Lloyd Barber and Rick Wright requested driver licenses, while Willis Judd, Ellis White, William Dunaway, Michael Smith, and Freddie Case all applied for mechanics licenses. We don't know much more about those folks or what happened to them, aside from the fact that they were all left behind at the track when Wright bounced. Other expenses included somewhere between $1,500 and $1,800 to get a few sets of Goodyear tires, $1,200 in parts from Travis Tiller, and $168 to the Southern Textile Association to have custom jackets made for his crew. All told, Wright spent $23,000 to get his faux racing career off the ground, which today comes out around $76,000. Most of that money was spent in the form of checks that bounced when folks tried to cash them. But from my really brief calculations, it seems like Wright was able to walk away with around $22,000 in cash, or around $70,000 today. There are others who claim to have been swindled by Wright as well, including a man named Bob Tubert who said he was Wright's neighbor. When Wright skipped town, he allegedly also loaded up Tubert's riding mower. Wright's landlord and South Central Bell Telephone Company soon joined the party and stated that Wright had written them bad checks. United Trappers Marketing Association owner Dean McIntyre claimed to be out $10,000 on account of Wright. In the aftermath, the myth that surrounded Wright only grew and grew. In a June 22nd edition of the Tennessean, writer Larry Woody painted a hugely appealing portrait of Wright. "Just call him the mystery driver," he wrote. "Nobody knows where he came from and nobody knows where he went. A lot of people, including NASCAR officials and the police, would sure like to find out because the mystery driver has disappeared, leaving behind a trail of worthless checks, question marks, and red faces." Woody claims that Wright did to auto racing what Rosie Ruiz did to marathoning, referring to the Cuban runner who won the 1980 Boston Marathon by skipping most of the course and joining back on just before the finish. Larry Woody said Wright, quote, talked NASCAR out of a license, and that he, quote, talked Sterling Marlin out of a race car. Future NASCAR Hall of Famer Benny Parsons added his own 2 cents, saying, "It's a sad commentary on the sport when somebody can walk in off the street with no apparent racing background, take $20,000 to $25,000, and buy his way into a race." Doyle Ford, the field manager for NASCAR with a home base in Nashville, told the Tennessean that "I've been in business for 24 years and I've never seen a case like it." I want to quote fairly extensively from Ford here, who explains from his perspective a lot of what happened. Quote, "There's a thing called a right to work law, and if he meets our rules and expectations, then there's no way NASCAR can legally keep him from at least filling an entry and attempting to qualify for the race. Anybody can literally walk in off the street and, if they have the money and equipment, enter a race. But like I said, this was an unprecedented case because it's unusual for somebody as obviously unqualified as Wright to try to get into a race. First of all, there's the expense, about $30,000 or more just for a race car, and not to mention the danger. A guy who doesn't know what he's doing could easily get killed out there. He had probably raced somewhere before, maybe on some little dirt track, but he sure hadn't been where he'd said he'd been or raced what he said he'd raced. It's a good thing he's such a good talker, because when everybody tracks him down, he's going to have a lot of explaining to do." For all the big talking and all the warnings that someone would track Wright down, the man vanished, seemingly into thin air. The next weekend, Specialist Magazine Grand National Scene reported that Wright was one of 2 drivers who failed to qualify for the Cracker Barrel Country Store 420, which was hosted at Nashville Speedway. It's not clear if he actually showed up for that event. It's kind of hard to think folks would have completely ignored the appearance of the guy who had just swindled them out of thousands of dollars. But after that, L.W. Wright disappeared. If you've gotten this far, I know what you're thinking. How the hell did some guy just bullshit his way into the 1982 Winston 500? Why didn't someone realize he was a fraudster? How come no one fact-checked any of his claims before they started handing over money and parts in newspaper articles? I think the big thing here is that, again, this wasn't always easy to figure out. If you don't recognize a driver on a NASCAR Cup Series entry list today in 2025, you can open up Google, search that driver's name, and almost instantly know something about them. If they don't have a Wikipedia page where existing information is all compiled together into one place, you'll probably still find something. You should be able to find their results and past events no matter what series they've competed in. You should be able to find their social media accounts, plus a professional website with contact information. Maybe you can even pull up a video of this driver on YouTube to get a sense of how they move when they talk. And if you can't find that much, well, you can always put a call for more information out on your social media. There's a good chance that someone has the same questions as you, or perhaps someone knows the driver personally and can vouch for them. In the course of an afternoon, you could probably figure out this driver's middle name, the name of his dog, his email address, his height, and his best finish. But that just wasn't a thing in 1982. The concept of fact-checking as we understand it today, as this singular identifiable category of journalism with dedicated researchers who spend all day verifying information, didn't really exist as a career. In the 1930s, young women were brought into big publications like Time magazine to check out details of stories and assume responsibility for any incorrect information that was published. But even then, newspaper publishing stems from a long tradition of subjectivity and opinion. World War I introduced a hunger for more accurate reporting, and Time was a leader on that front, but primarily it was deemed women's work and not a valid career path worthy of respect. Even through the 1980s and 1990s, as fact-checking became a more well-established career path, inconsistencies were still extremely common, especially in more niche publications like motorsport press. Let me offer some examples of what I mean here. If you've read my book, Racing with Rich Energy, you might remember a brief notation on the conflicted spelling of a name. My co-author Alanis King and I wrote, quote, "The AP reported in January 1992 that Andrea Sassetti, sometimes called Antonio Sassetti by the papers, had bought out the remains of the unheard-of Scuderia Coloni team. Sassetti ultimately became the head of Andrea Moda F1, which is still widely regarded as the worst F1 team of all time. But most of the publications of that era that we read didn't agree on a spelling for his first name." Alanis and I were fastidious in fact-checking our book, mostly to avoid a lawsuit, and the Andrea versus Antonio Sassetti debacle resulted in, and I'm not kidding, hours of debate. We felt like we couldn't definitively refer to this man as any one name because those names didn't agree. That's why we added in the note that he was sometimes referred to as Antonio. A friend of mine who goes by Kazi F1 on social media raised another issue about factual inconsistency. She's a big fan of the Austrian driver Helmut Koenig, whose Formula One experiment resulted in the tragic death at Watkins Glen. But a misspelling of his first name appeared in one Autosport article. It featured an H at the end of helmet. After that point, Kazi noted that the incorrect spelling became incredibly common, but that his birth certificate and his gravestone both contain the correct spelling of his name, the one without the H. She also points out that the misspelling was repeated regularly by the motorsport press, as in by journalists who knew Koenig and who probably should have known the proper spelling of his name. So when someone at the Tennessean received a press release from some guy named L.W. Wright purporting that he'd be competing in the Winston 500, well, it doesn't really shock me that no one double-checked, or that if they did double-check, they were directed to speak with someone who was also in on a joke, or who could claim that Wright was a real legitimate person. But after that first publication, Wright had all the legitimacy he needed to start chatting with car owners and suppliers. He could just show them the article and say, "See, I'm serious." Although, if we're being honest, a lot of folks in motorsport probably wouldn't look at you twice today if you cut them a handsome check for some tires. They probably wouldn't know that you even scammed them until they tried to cash the check. And of course, that doesn't excuse NASCAR allowing him to race, even after it became clear that he'd fudged his sponsors, and that no one had heard of him, and that he was also just slow on the track. Allowing a totally inexperienced person to compete at one of the series' biggest racetracks was a recipe for disaster, and it is honestly a miracle that no one got hurt. NASCAR, though, was formed at the intersection of fast driving and fast talking. A scandal like that of L.W. Wright was about as authentically originally NASCAR as you could get. Months passed, then years, decades. The moment L.W. Wright collected his starting money and walked out of Talladega, he seemingly disappeared. The story of the mysterious scammer who conned his way into the Winston 500 started to shift into the realm of the legendary, with Wright joining the likes of D.B. Cooper and even the Zodiac Killer as this incredible faceless force that disrupted the world as we knew it. The more time passed, the more unlikely a big discovery would be. But then on April 29th, 2022, we got an announcement that L.W. Wright had been found. That was the word of Rick Houston on the Scene Vault podcast, at least. Houston announced that not only had he discovered the true identity of L.W. Wright, but that he had spoken to the man who had evaded capture for decades. Several days later, on the anniversary of the Winston 500, the Scene Vault released a short excerpt of their full conversation with NASCAR's Man of Mystery. Rick Houston and Steve Wade, the hosts of the show, stated that they verified Wright's identity through detailed stories he had told, as well as by laying eyes on the actual fire suit that Wright wore during that 1982 race. Here we start to learn some of the actual details. L.W. Wright's name was Larry Ernest Wright, and he was born in 1949 in the quiet town of Richlands, Virginia, one of 8 children born to a father firmly entrenched in the local coal mining industry. The details of Wright's life are pretty sparse. We know small things like the fact that he used to run moonshine and that he had a background in short track racing in Virginia. We know that he lost his eldest brother in the Vietnam War and that he had some level of personal involvement himself with the U.S. Army, though we don't know if that means he was deployed. We know he tried his hand at coal mining like his father, but that ultimately his life was dotted with run-ins with the law and financial troubles. Of course, it's hard to know what parts of this story are true and what ones aren't. In different interviews, after being discovered, Wright shared facts that conflicted with some of the other statements he'd been making, and he also firmly denied any wrongdoing regarding NASCAR's 1982 Winston 500. Quote, "If you can find someone that said I owed them $30,000, you tell them I will face them," Wright said on the podcast. "I want to see who they are, and I want to know how it come about. If it makes them stutter, then you know what I'm talking about, okay?" He also added that he had, quote, "a lot of friends in country music, and I didn't use any of them other than what they wanted to do." In the episode, we learned tons of fun little facts, such as that Wright adopted the number 34 for his Monte Carlo out of respect for Wendell Scott, the first full-time black racer in the NASCAR Cup Series. Per Wright, he chose Scott's number because, quote, "he was one who already tried to race but didn't have the means or the money. So I picked up 34. Plus, I was 34 years old when I started racing." We learned that allegedly 2 NASCAR stars came up to Wright to offer some words of advice. Bobby Allison told him not to worry too much if he didn't make the field, but said, quote, "Well, you're cocky enough." Then after practice, Dale Earnhardt allegedly said, "When you get out there, you get on the back of someone who'd been here before and follow them, stay with them, and then make your move." Wright had never seen Talladega when he turned up to race, and he recounts his shock at laying eyes on it in the episode, saying, "That straightaway is almost a mile long. How much can that car gain before you go into that turn? I said, Lord, I'm down here, but I'm going to need some help, and I didn't tell nobody else that." That seems like it adds a little bit of context to his performance over the weekend. We also know that shortly after speaking with the Scene Vault, Wright was in trouble with the law once again. In February of 2023, he was arrested by an officer from the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force after a 2.5-week manhunt. Wright was charged with theft, over $2,500, burglary, writing worthless checks, and evading arrest. Though he was captured in Knox County, Tennessee, he had multiple warrants out for his arrest all across Tennessee, Alabama, and Virginia, for everything from violating his parole to his involvement in the sudden disappearance of property in a residence that Wright was renting, including a Corvette. Wright was never sentenced. Just under a year later, on January 27, 2024, he died of colon cancer in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 74 years old. There are plenty of details that we still don't know and questions that will likely never be answered. When the Scene Vault announced that it had spoken to Wright, they stated that they'd had a 90-minute conversation with him about the wildest tales of his youth. But they only opted to release a 10-minute clip from the conversation with a promise that we'd be able to find the full details in a book they were hoping to publish. That book has never materialized, nor has the full conversation. Further, while the Scene Vault actually spoke to Wright, there's a whole community of people who feel that they should get some credit for their research. YouTuber NBR, for example, published 2 videos showing his process of tracking down Wright. Though NBR didn't speak with the man in question, he did do a lot of the heavy lifting to uncover some possible identities for Wright, which may have allowed others to build on what he'd found. But there's no way to know for certain. There's no way to know why Wright concocted this elaborate con. If he addressed it in the Scene Vault podcast, then that wasn't one of the clips that got shared with the public. There's no way he could have gone into this just to make a quick buck, because I'll be honest, this is absurdly audacious. There are probably about 1,000 different ways to have more easily made a lot of money, ways that didn't involve forking over a few thousand in cash for a race car and tires and custom racing jackets for your buddies. And if money was the whole goal, why didn't Wright just take all of the equipment with him when he left to pawn it off? Why not just take the $37,000 in cash from Bernie Terrell and disappear without, going car shopping? L.W. Wright didn't seem like a massive racing fan, but honestly, who among us wouldn't want to snap up a chance to race in NASCAR? I mean, it's a hell of a lot cheaper and a whole lot easier to con your way into racing on the big stage one time than it would be to put in the money and the effort to actually refine your talent and work your way up through the ranks. Or maybe he was just one of those guys who wanted to see what he could get away with. Maybe he got a little thrill from a good swindle. And to be honest, what cooler way to swindle somebody than to con your way into the Winston 500? Even though we may have learned the real identity of NASCAR's DB Cooper, there are still so many questions that have lingered over the years without any real answer. All we can guarantee is that somewhere out there is a feature film-length interview with L.W. Wright, and I hope that one day we get to learn what it says. NASCAR in the 1980s was a totally different beast than the sport we know it to be today. Tune into any Cup Series race, and there's a damn good chance you recognize every single driver starting in the event. Or at least, you'll recognize their names. You can also expect a certain level of clarity from NASCAR. If someone cheats, they will be caught, they will be punished, and Elton Sawyer might even show off the offending part to media so fans can understand exactly what happened. If there's a driver whose name you don't recognize on a starting grid, you can head over to NASCAR's website or to Racing Reference and browse that driver's results spanning back to their childhood. If a crew member does something that even threatens to violate a rule or even a guideline of suggested decorum, the sanctioning body will have to address it. But that wasn't always the case. After all, this is a discipline that grew out of illegal moonshine running, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that there was a little bit of suspended belief when it came to scams. In the 80s, it was easy to cheat, and it was easy to get up to no good. This is the era where Ricky Rudd won a race with his eyelids taped open after bursting blood vessels in his eyes during a crash. An era where Rudd could joke with reporters like Steve Wade about snorting a couple lines of cocaine a day to keep the pain away. It was also the era where the rule book was written with plenty of leeway for folks to try out nitrous oxide, or to mess around with their tires, or to casually disturb a timing light with a laser for a better qualifying time. If you're only familiar with modern NASCAR, it's really easy to be caught off guard by some of the more unsavory elements of its history, back when there weren't eyes on the sport at every moment, and before social media gave us a live feed of what everyone in the sport is up to. It was a world where you could pass a few bucks to a tech inspector to turn the other cheek, and where a man could just turn up one day writing checks with the intention of fraudulently becoming a NASCAR driver. Was that strange? Sure, but so were a lot of other things. At the end of the day, L.W. Wright gave us one hell of a story to tell, and one fascinating opportunity to look back at NASCAR and the days gone by. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and welcome back. In the next episode, we're celebrating the season of love by digging into the many romantic affairs of Enzo Ferrari and how his relationships impacted his business. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack and Patreon, where I'll be digging into contemporary motorsport news, breaking down the barriers of becoming a racing journalist, and keeping you up to date on everything you need to be reading. Finally, if you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, or just want to reach out and say hi, I have an email address for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, let's end with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm going to give a shout out to some of my most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find a full list of sources in the episode description. This week I drew on some great work from the Scene Vault, including the pieces of that groundbreaking interview they recorded with L.W. Wright back in 2022. I highly recommend queuing that up for a listen next. I also grabbed some details from Crispian Besley's book, Driven to Crime. That's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and I'll see you soon.